try to get started right now. So hi everyone, thank you for being here, making the time to come here. My name is Yuna. I'm a senior studying cognitive science and education, and I'm one of the coordinators for the 2018 Theories in Action, along with Meg Mori, who's actually just submitting her thesis for her master's degree right now, so she should be joining us in a little while. So just a little about Theories in Action before we actually get started. We're in our 9th year right now, and this year our theme is how has your Brown experience helped you to connect the dots? So this will be an awesome roundtable on 3 individuals who completed or will be completing their independent concentrations this year, and their title is History, Storytelling, and Making the Past Present. And I'll let each roundtable presenter introduce themselves. I'd also like to thank Dean Peggy Chang for not only being an awesome boss and being able to work with her, but also just being such a compassionate and supportive member of our community. I think we can all speak on that and can all agree on that. So thank you, Peggy, for helping to facilitate and for also just making the Brown experience such an integral part of all of us.
Thank you, Yuna. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Peggy Chang. As Yuna said, I work at the Curricular Resource Center for Peer Advising with Yuna and Meg, and the CRC with the Office of the Dean of the College is responsible for this event, Theories in Action, which is taking place throughout the week. I'm very pleased to be facilitating this session, which features 3 of the 11 independent concentrators graduating this May. They initially wanted to kind of do an individual talk, and when they came together, they realized they actually had a lot in common thematically. So they will be speaking about their thesis or capstone work, but also sort of being in dialogue together about the theme that they came up with, history, storytelling, and making the past present. Our first speaker will be Conor Regan. He's studying independently in a concentration that is a well-established field in the world called Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Conor is from Newburyport, Massachusetts, and he transferred here from George Washington University. Our second speaker will be Annie Prusky. She's from outside of Philadelphia, and she designed an independent concentration called Sociocultural Linguistics. She spent the past year doing research and working on an exhibit about the history of the deaf community in Rhode Island, which is due to be installed at the Lippitt House Museum in a few days. Correct? Yes, ish. Okay, and our last speaker will be Brett Halperin. Brett is from Sudbury, Massachusetts. He designed an independent concentration called Government and Economics, and he decided to do a capstone project that I only recently learned is a game of some sorts, and he's going to be demoing it during the session today. So without further ado, our first speaker is Conor.
Thank you, Peggy. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. So I wrote my thesis on U.S. intervention in the Balkans as a framework for Syria policy. I'd first like to thank Professor David Estlund, Professor Omer Bartov, Professor Richard Boucher for all their help. Writing this thesis would not have been possible without their valuable feedback and expertise. None of them, unfortunately, could make it here today, but their help is very much appreciated. So the basic structure of the talk is I'll go over why I chose this topic. I'll go over sort of the broader challenge posed to foreign policymakers right now in 2018, and then I will give some brief lessons from the Balkans for Syria policy today. So as an independent concentrator in philosophy, politics, and economics, as Peggy mentioned, I had some bandwidth in choosing a thesis topic. My concentration emphasizes courses in international politics, and much of my focus within the broader subjects of PPE is on foreign policy. So I knew I wanted to write about a contemporary challenge in international affairs. Now, the period of time between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the September 11 attacks is a unique decade for American foreign policy. There was no driving ideological challenge that consumed policy like the Cold War era, and the war on terror had not yet preoccupied successive administrations. The real tests and questions posed in this decade addressed fundamental assumptions about American interests internationally, as dovish versus hawkish foreign policy debates played out publicly, similar to today. I ultimately chose to research lessons from American efforts in the 1995 Bosnian War and 1999 Kosovo War to Syrian policy today because of the similarities in the arguments made against Balkan intervention then and the arguments against Syrian intervention today. So before getting into an overview of Syria policy informed by lessons from U.S. intervention in the Balkans, I want to address why I believe the topic of foreign policy to be so germane to and emblematic of the state of our national politics today. So the 2016 election was unprecedented in many ways, and the debate that ensued over American foreign policy was no exception. We had grown accustomed to presidential candidates with different views on America's role in the world, but we had never experienced a presidential candidate like Donald Trump, who questioned the very fabric and conventional wisdom of American foreign policy that has dominated for the last 70 years. Trump asked the instinctual questions that resonated with many Americans, like, what do we really get out of alliances like NATO? Why are we spending on foreign aid when we have our own economic problems domestically? Are international trade agreements really beneficial for the average American worker? And why do we have any business being involved in the Middle East when Iraq was a disaster, Afghanistan is seemingly never-ending, and we have our own, quote, crumbling infrastructure to fix at home? The abiding sentiment seemed to be, let's spend domestically, not abroad, in far-flung conflicts where insoluble ethnic violence dates back time immemorial. Now, these questions are not baseless, and they both importantly challenge long-standing assumptions and prompt the fundamental question that I believe every foreign policy official has to ask themselves in 2018. Why is whatever issue I am working on important and worthy of time and resources when the main point, the driving problem globally, is how do we deal with the tectonic shifts in our economy produced by the earthquake that is globalization and automation? Now, the question is easier to answer for some global issues than others. Clearly, the Kim regime's development of a nuclear weapon in North Korea poses an existential threat to countries in the region, and it's a major national security challenge for the United States. What about Syria? Why does the United States have any core interest in Syria or responsibility for ending its civil war? So the case that I want to make to you today is that the United States does have a direct interest in ending the conflict in Syria. We have an opportunity to do so by employing diplomatic and military lessons learned from past intervention in Bosnia in 1995 and Kosovo in 1999. But as President Obama repeatedly said, this cannot be done on the cheap, so strong rationale and foresight to develop an exit strategy is needed to commit the United States to an interventionist policy in the Middle East in the wake of Iraq and in the midst of so many other contemporary challenges that warrant our attention and resources. We have some cartoons here to demonstrate these stark shifts in foreign policy proposal. Trump soliciting some cash from Angela Merkel, indicative of his transactional view of foreign policy in NATO. And this is Trump leaving the TPP and inviting Xi Jinping to take a larger role in international trade agreements in that area. So just to give you some context here, it's very difficult to visualize challenges like this, and it's hard for us all the way over here to really understand the gravity of what's happening in Syria. I know I struggled with this because you read so many numbers that are so devastating. This was Aleppo in 2012. This is Aleppo in 2016. It is a radical change. This city has been absolutely decimated by pro-Assad bombing. So the lessons from the Balkans for Syria policy. I'll go over a general outline. The first question that you have to answer is, what is the core U.S. interest at stake in Syria? Prudent American intervention is predicated on the following three assumptions of an American interest. First, I believe the U.S. has a core interest in ending the Syrian civil war in the shortest possible time frame for the aforementioned humanitarian consequences. 500,000 Syrians have lost their lives. 5.6 million Syrians have fled, and approximately 6 million are displaced internally. The outflow of approximately 6 million refugees has placed an unsustainable strain on key U.S. allies such as Turkey, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and have distorted the politics of many European countries, in addition to distorting the politics of immigration in the United States with real consequences. Second, I believe the United States has a strategic interest in removing Bashar al-Assad from power. The Syrian dictator has deployed chemical weapons against women and children, has orchestrated the killing of his own people by the hundreds of thousands. The precedent of allowing a dictator such as Assad to remain in power after such actions is too dangerous for the long-term values and goals of American foreign policy. And finally, the U.S. has a core national security interest in Syria to prevent the Levant from remaining a training ground for terrorist factions that seek to directly strike the United States. America must be involved in crafting the governing framework in a post-war Syria to mitigate the potential for terrorist occupation and lawless territorial vacuums. So what is the potential policy path forward? There's a number of key components to this. The first step is the brokering of a ceasefire. The current state of military operations on the ground is an essential component when looking at actually brokering a ceasefire. These ceasefires have been constantly negotiated since 2012 with very little success. And there's a number of things that we can learn from how this was done in Bosnia to perhaps bring some success in the near future. So Richard Holbrooke, who spearheaded the Clinton organization's team, was delegated near complete autonomy by President Clinton. And the primary strategy that led to a lasting ceasefire in Bosnia and ultimately the Dayton Accord success was the Clinton's team's emphasis on building a coalition between Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats against Bosnian Serbs. And just as uniting the Croat and Bosnian Muslim opposition to the Serbs was critical for Dayton, developing unified opposition forces to Assad will be critical for Syrian negotiations. And this, I believe, is going to require a strategic partnership between a number of these opposition factions in Syria. Now, another key aspect in a change in policy today is these unification efforts must be enacted in concert with U.S. airstrikes and pro-Assad forces, which is a significant change in policy that will change the dynamic on the ground in Syria and allow the U.S. to negotiate a lasting ceasefire from a position of strength. Second, the location of the talks are of paramount importance. After the United States has implemented these policy changes and ceasefire negotiations are to commence, I believe that they ought to be held in Turkey. Now, the importance of the summit's location cannot be overstated. Richard Holbrooke in Bosnia vehemently argued that a meeting on U.S. soil would increase the United States' psychological and physical control of the process. Given that the U.S. does not have dominant control over Syrian negotiations that it had in Bosnia, argue that Turkey is the most advantageous location for a dispositive summit. The third step, and really the most critical piece of all this, is what is the actual substance of a diplomatic agreement? And there are 5 elements of the Dayton Accords, which was the eventual framework that ended the war in Bosnia, that I transpose into policy recommendations for contemporary Syrian peace negotiations. The first step is the release of sanctions on Russia is going to be an enormous bargaining chip for the United States, and ultimately these sanctions will have to be lifted for a number of diplomatic concessions. Second, the state of Syria will be internally partitioned as reflected in a government structure where there is one central government that handles foreign affairs and national finances, and 5 separate ethnic entities that are to be established that handle the governance of local issues such as policing, education, and security. Third, to relieve the refugee burden on foreign countries and repopulate Syria, refugees will have to return to Syria to have the right to vote in a future election. And finally, a World Bank stimulus package will be injected into the Syrian economy following the successful completion of a peace accord. Now, the final component to all this is the implementation and exit strategy. Comparable to Syria, in 1995, the notion of deploying American troops to Bosnia was widely unpopular. Approximately 70% of Americans disapproved of sending young men and women of the United States Armed Forces to a far-off European war zone that had relentlessly fought for the past 4 years. Americans regarded Bosnia as somebody else's civil war. 3 key lessons from the implementation of Dayton should be applied for Syria now. First, a NATO implementation force must include both American troops and coordinated Russian troops and have a clear deadline for exit from Syria. Second, the arrest of war criminals in Syria must be of paramount importance and a clear priority during the implementation of an agreement. Finally, foreign forces and proxy militias must be swiftly and thoroughly removed from the country during implementation. In conclusion, the Clinton administration's interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo teach us important lessons for crafting a bold Syria policy today. These lessons are not important because Bosnia and Kosovo had identical ethnic makeups and challenges to the Syrian war. Syria is a different war with different obstacles and peace. The lessons are rather profound because of what they demonstrate about America's capacity to make positive change in complicated foreign conflicts. These policy recommendations are far from guaranteed successes and rest heavily on proper prediction of geopolitical ripples and cause and effect. That is, after all, the nature of foreign policy. These choices, however, are indicative of an engaged America that gives its best effort to end a war that has taken far too much from the Syrian people. The seemingly impossible was done in Dayton and can be done again in Syria. Thank you.
Before we switch over to Annie, Conor is ready to take some questions, or a question, if there is one. I have a question about how you became interested in this topic.
Yeah. Foreign policy is one of my main interests, just academically. I've been interested since I was a young kid. My grandfather was a foreign service officer, and it's something that I'd always talked with about my parents around the dinner table, and it's something that I continued my studies at Brown. Yeah, Nick?
What do you think the feasibility of something like this being implemented?
The feasibility in the Trump administration, I would say, is close to zero. But I would say in the future there's a legitimate chance for this. It depends on the foreign policy views of the Secretary of State and the President at the time, but I'd like to think that there's a chance that we're going to be more engaged in Syria and put this to an end. Yeah, Ryan.
You mentioned the World Bank stimulus as a part of a solution for this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Given that there's been kind of shaky history in getting all of that money actually to the countries who are receiving aid, and also given how unstable the region is, would you do like anything different from past? Like would the Bosnia aid example inform Syria in your model, or how do you envision that?
So the aid in Bosnia is definitely a model for how I'm thinking about this. That's the general framework. There was considerably more money spent as an incentive for the Bosnian Croats and the Bosnian Muslims to coalesce against the Bosnian Serbs than is being spent relatively to try to unite rebel forces in Syria. Again, one of the largest difficulties of Syria that I need to underscore is that the rebel factions are not homogenous. They're a lot easier to identify by ethnic makeup in Bosnia. But this kind of incentive could actually provide some fodder for these groups to coalesce and work together. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
I'm curious to see how your strategy incorporates the issue with the movement towards a Kurdish national state, considering that the hypothetical summit would be in Turkey, and Turkey would oppose a Kurdish national state, whereas the United States has been supporting Kurdish revolutionary movements. How does that translate as a comparison to issues that were in the Balkans?
Yeah, it's a good question. The Kurds are one of the real complicating factors in this because the way the geopolitics have played, we may not have been able to predict from the start of the civil war. The Turkish government, as you know, has incurred into Syria recently and has actually been fighting some of these Kurdish forces. Kurds are seen domestically in Syria. The Kurdish Working Party is a terrorist organization as far as the Turks are concerned. So their relationship with the Kurds is really frayed. I think that there's a number of political considerations that go into this, but one of them is that actually holding this summit in Turkey may give some incentive for Erdogan to be more flexible about how he thinks these negotiations would play out. I think that if you held it in the United States, he would feel even less control over the process. It's also important to hold it there as opposed to in a more Western-oriented nation because of the relationship with Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin and Erdogan have been developing some, they've been working in concert more than the U.S. is comfortable in recent weeks. So I think this could also go to appeasing sort of our tensions with Putin. Yeah.
You described the Trump's election as like a major sea change moment in foreign policy approaches. Do you see any particular features of your proposal appealing to or being enticing for disaffected citizens who found Trump's platform appealing at the time?
It's a great question. There's a general answer to that question, which is that when you're talking about foreign policy, you really need to make the connection about how our relationship with the world affects the domestic economy at home. These things are inextricably linked at this point. There is a massive issue in the United States right now, as we know politically, about refugee outflows. And there's a perception among many Americans who support Donald Trump that there are Syrian nationals who we do not want coming into this country, and they put a lot of strain on European countries. I think that this proposal could at least be appealing in that regard, that we can finally start to stymie this outflow. I'd also like to believe that Donald Trump has shown some willingness to actually engage the pro-Assad forces in a way that the Obama administration wouldn't. They sent some strikes in the past couple weeks directly hitting Assad's forces, and the Obama administration was much more reticent to do that. So I think that feature of this also may play well into the foreign policy views of National Security Advisor Bolton and Pompeo when confirmed. Yeah, Spiro.
Thanks for your presentation. You kind of talked a little bit about making diplomatic concessions to Russia. That, I mean, in my opinion, would be kind of an unpopular decision amongst, United States citizens. How do you foresee that playing out in the near future, if that was something to be implemented?
So I couldn't get too much into this just from the time constraints, but one of the larger challenges in the Syrian civil war that did not exist in Bosnia was that this has become a proxy war for a number of different countries. Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran. Iran and Russia are working in concert to some extent, and the Iranians are vehemently opposed to what the Saudi Arabians are doing in the country and vice versa. But Russia is really it's the largest issue with this, and we have to find a way to work with the Russians going forward. I completely agree that diplomatic concessions with Russia are not going to be popular with a lot of citizens at home. And that's part of the nature of leadership. You have to make the argument why it is necessary and why it's not in our interest to have a continually escalating proxy war with Russia in Syria. But what I think that actually looks like, manifested in concrete policy choices, is there's going to be a trade-off with the Minsk agreement right now in Ukraine. For those of you who are familiar with that, there are some things we can do there to perhaps concede our support of the rebels in Ukraine right now. We're fighting against the pro-Russian annexation-oriented groups that we could then triage back into Syrian policy. I can get more into that later if anybody's curious, but I agree with you that it would not be a popular position.
Great, Conor, thank you so much. There'll be time for more questions for all the panelists at the end. Without further ado, Annie Prusky.
Thank you.
So before I get started, I want to there's so much food. Please eat food.
Annie?
Oh, yes, thank you. Okay. So yes, before I get started, please go eat the food. It's delicious, and I want it to be consumed. Okay, so I titled my presentation Accessibility, Community, and History, Adapting a Deaf-Friendly Museum. So I'm going to unpack all of that, but I want to start with telling you a little bit about myself. Who am I? That is my face. I'm a senior doing an independent concentration in sociocultural linguistics. So sociocultural linguistics is trying to understand the way that language impacts individual identity as well as systemic structures, culture, and specifically power relations among people. And in my particular case, what I have focused on is American Studies and English, American English, Deaf Studies and American Sign Language, and Jewish Studies and Hebrew. My capstone project, final senior project, dealt primarily with the interactions between the first two, between the American community and the deaf community, the American hearing community and the American deaf community, and interactions between English and American Sign Language. So, My capstone project was developing a tour at the Lippitt House Museum. So the Lippitt House Museum is a museum on Hope Street across from the Wheeler School. Most Brown students and staff walk by it most days, and we never go inside. That was me up until the summer before my senior year. And it's a very interesting museum. So that is Henry Lippitt. He was a governor of Rhode Island in the 1880s. And this is his family's house. So he built this house for his family. And that's why it's called a house museum, because when you walk in, it is a home. There is furniture, there are beds, dining room tables, everything that looks like a house. And the museum is focused on the late Victorian era, so what is called by the museum the Golden Age of Providence, i.e. when Providence was a center of industry and a major city in the United States. So that's roughly 1850 to 1910. This is what the museum looks like on the inside. As you can see, it's rooms of a house. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the process of developing the tour, but picture something in your head that looks like a house. So I want to talk a little bit about engaged scholarship, because when I was doing this project, I didn't come in planning to develop a tour. I came in as an accessibility intern for the Lippitt House Museum, saying, here are my skills, here's my knowledge, what can I do to help? And what the museum really wanted was to make itself more accessible to the deaf and hard of hearing community. So I'll get into specifically why their interest in the deaf community in a moment. But I wanted to talk about what engaged scholarship is and why it was so important to me to not come in with an idea, but to wait for the idea to develop. So a lot of times research can be very exploitative. So people go into communities and they say, here's what I want to do. I want to study you. I want to do interviews with you, and then I want to leave. And the final product of that research ultimately doesn't help anyone in that community. It really only benefits the researcher. And it was really important to me that I conduct a project that would benefit me because I want to learn, but would also benefit the community that I was working with. And the community that I was working with, I thought of first primarily as the Providence deaf community, secondarily the Providence and Rhode Island hearing community, and third, the American deaf community and myself. So along that vein, I want to acknowledge my partners in this project before I go any further. So Nancy Vanaco, Thomas Starden, John Confreda, Barbara Confreda, and Tim Riker, who is here. So these are all members of the Rhode Island deaf community. And so I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable on American Sign Language and deaf studies, but obviously deaf folks are the real expert in that. So it was really important to me to be working with deaf folks on this project. So they were contributing their expertise in their experiences with museums, their experience with accessibility and with language, and I was contributing Brown's resources, my editing skills in Adobe Premiere, and my relationship with the museum. And as well, my advisors. Tim Riker is also one of my advisors, as is Carrie Taylor, who is the director of the Lippitt House Museum. So this is a picture of a woman on a horse. This is, yes, shocking. This is Jeannie Lippitt, who is the daughter of Henry Lippitt, the governor who I mentioned earlier. And I want to use her story, a brief glimpse into her story, as a way to sort of unpack the power dynamics that I was dealing with as I created this tour. So this caption down here says, Jeannie, totally deaf, the idol of the family, her mother's triumph, loved to ride about the east side. So the east side here is the east side of Providence. The house behind her is the Lippitt House, which is today the Lippitt House Museum. She is riding on a horse on the east side, which is entertaining. But what is interesting to me in this quote is that it's not really about Jeannie as a person. It's very much focused on the fact that she was deaf, and throughout Jeannie's life, and even after she passed away, most of what was written about her was focused on, isn't it amazing that she was deaf and she learned to talk? Isn't it amazing that she was deaf and she was still able to do stuff? Which is really at odds with what I have learned about the deaf community, how deaf folks usually think about themselves as whole and complex individuals and not just amazing because they're deaf and they still function. And particularly what stands out to me is the phrase, her mother's triumph. So there was a short book written about Jeannie that was called Her Mother's Triumph after this quote, and it is difficult to unpack fully in a short amount of time the extent to which Jeannie was used as a poster child for an approach to deaf education that was not popular when she was born, but became extremely popular due to her success in it. So that is oralism. There are generally two methods of educating deaf kids. There's an approach which includes sign language, which includes gestures and visual aids, going towards the natural inclinations of deaf folks. And there's oralism, which eschews sign language, visual aids, gestures, and focuses entirely on getting deaf people to be as similar to hearing people as possible, focusing on reading lips and producing speech. And when Jeannie was born, she was born hearing, and she became deaf when she was 4. And at the time, the main option for education was to go to a deaf school, which became the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut. But her mother did not want to send her there. We don't know exactly why. It's possible she just didn't want her daughter going all the way to Connecticut. But what I think is more likely is that she didn't think that sign language was going to enable Jeannie to be involved in the high society of the Lippitts. They were a very, very wealthy family. Obviously, they were a very powerful family. And I think that Jeannie signing and using sign as her main method of communication would have separated her from her family, and her family would have felt that that would have sort of lowered her in their esteem, in the esteem of their community. So they wanted to really make sure that she was able to participate in that fancy world. Okay, so before I go on, so those are sort of the dynamics that I wanted to avoid in the tour. So when I was creating this tour, I didn't want it to be me, a hearing person, saying, here's what I want the tour to look like. You deaf people, make it happen. I really wanted it to be a partnership. I didn't want to recreate the dynamics between Jeannie and her mother, between Jeannie and her hearing society. I wanted to be a true equal partnership. So part of that involved, I applied for a grant and used most of the money for that grant to pay my partners so that they weren't coming in on their own time and their own dollar. They were being compensated for their work. And also I was able to invest appropriately in the museum and in the tour so that purchasing tablets and other materials so that when deaf folks come to the museum, they will fully be able to access the tour. And it is not just like a one-time exhibit or on paper or something that will go away. It has the money to be sustainable. So what did the process look like? So I went to the museum a lot. I spent a lot of time there following tours. So during sort of the summer months, May to October, the museum is open once or twice a week, and people give tours, docents give tours of the museum to anyone who comes in. Those tours are in English, and they do not hire interpreters, so the museum is totally inaccessible to deaf and hard of hearing folks, or it was. So what I did was I followed people around on those tours. I took notes on what they said in each room, both the general ideas of what was going on in the room, whether they were talking about women in Victorian society or the relationships between the Lippitts and their servants or architecture, or whether they were talking about very tiny details of the house. It's a beautiful house. It's very artistically interesting. And so there's a lot to be learned as well about the decor of Victorian-era Providence, the sometimes confusing and shocking tastes of the Victorians, as well as sort of a larger understanding of industry in Providence, of which almost everything in the Lippitt house was made in Rhode Island, which is very interesting. So that also helps expand our knowledge about Rhode Island. So I followed the tour, I accumulated notes until I was able to create a script. So I didn't want this tour to be a translation. I wanted it to be an adaptation. ASL is not a written language, so I wasn't able to write in ASL. So I wrote in my first language, English, and I developed sort of a guide for what I wanted each room to look like. And then I went to my partners and I said, here's what I am thinking this room would be. What is the best way to adapt it to make it deaf-friendly, to make it accessible, and also interesting, because a written tour is very different from a presented tour in person or virtually. So then with my partners, I went through each room and we adapted the script, added in all the visual aids that we wanted to have, added in all the pictures. In an in-person tour at the museum, there's a lot of pointing out and touching and feeling. So there was also the matter of adapting that to a visual medium, a digital medium. So that included a lot of zoomed in pictures with specific artistic details that we wanted to point out and whatnot. And then the recording stage, which we just recently finished. So this was hundreds of hours in Brown Studios, working sometimes solo, but almost always with a partner, recording drafts and then final versions of what we wanted those tours to look like. And then the editing process, which I don't have any glamorous photos of, but Adobe Premiere is a wonderful thing. And then final videos. So I want to show a 30-second clip of what a video looks like so you can see what it looks like. I'm not going to ask the interpreter to interpret it. I will give a summary afterwards, so non-signers will just have to suck it up for a minute. Okay, so how do I go back into presenting this? Okay, cool. So that was a section of the first part of the tour, which takes place outside, hence the picture of the outside of the museum, talking about how Providence was founded and how the land was split up originally into little plots of land. And then it goes on to talk about how John Lippitt, an ancestor of Henry Lippitt, was among those founders and how their wealth was accumulated throughout generations. But what I wanted to show that section was because you can see there's a map and then there's a sort of translated version of the map that is easier to read. So in the in-person tour that happens in the museum, most people get a physical copy of a map of like ye olde Providence. And it is difficult to read even for someone where English is their first language. But for deaf folks where English is usually their second or third language, that map is very difficult to read and very difficult to understand. So in addition to translating it into an easier to read format and a somewhat simplified format while retaining the relevant and important information, I was also able to zoom in on particular parts of the map that were relevant to what we were discussing rather than pointing out like you would on a physical map. So one example of the adaptation to the digital realm. So the theme of this talk is history, storytelling, and making the past present. I personally learned a lot from this tour. I learned a lot about the city in which I've spent my entire undergraduate career. I've learned a lot about the history of the deaf community, which has been so welcoming and nurturing to me as I develop my skills. And I learned a lot about the complexities and the stickiness of the relationship of politics within the deaf community, as well as the politics of hearing and deaf communities interacting with each other. And most of all, what I learned when I started doing the tour was that the director of the museum, Carrie, really wanted the tour to be neutral. And what she meant by that was she didn't want it to be super special, different for deaf folks. She wanted the deaf tour, the ASL tour, to be equivalent to the hearing tour. And what I learned over the process was that it is impossible to tell a story about history that is neutral. When I visited those hearing tours, I heard again and again how sad and tragic it was that Jeannie became deaf and how beautiful and miraculous it was that she was able to learn to talk and able to learn French and how to horseback ride and all these things. And so that story, knowing that that story and that telling of history did not jibe with my understanding of the deaf community and what deaf folks told me about their community, I advocated for a change in that story, a change from what was perceived as neutral but what really wasn't, to something that was more complex. There is no telling of story that is neutral, but there are tellings of story that have full understandings, or as full as we can get, of the impacts of the way that previous stories, previous history, the Lippitts, Providence's golden age, and Jeannie impact the world that we have today. That's what I aimed for in my tour, was to have an understanding of the impacts of the way the Lippitt family and their politics impacted today. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Annie?
I'm curious, I know you had mentioned that you had a connection through Jeannie, excuse me, the museum's connection with Jeannie, but also there's a connection for the Rhode Island School for the Deaf, and when it was founded, and it was involved with this family. And my understanding, when they established the Rhode Island School for the Deaf as an oral school, but it changed through the years to what it is now, which is very different. It's a bilingual education using ASL and English. And so I'm curious, the museum doesn't really include a lot of that information as far as their involvement with establishing the School for the Deaf. And I'm wondering how how you could show that comparison between, the school then and the school now.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of that was encouraging the hearing tour to have more information about the Rhode Island School for the Deaf. Jeannie and her mother were the primary people who set up the Rhode Island School for the Deaf, and they set it up as an alternative to the signing school that I mentioned before, because they really wanted to promote oralism. And then that legacy was really harmful for a lot of deaf kids in Rhode Island. But as the school changed and it became more open to hiring deaf teachers and then eventually to putting ASL and English on equal playing fields, that the school has become one of the models of what bilingual education can be in the United States. So on a personal level, that's involved talking to the docents at the museum about that legacy and about what the school is like. I worked at the school last semester, so that really helped me inform. It says Jeannie and Marianne's names right at the beginning, at the entrance to the school. So that was very exciting to see sort of that connection playing out in real life. And then also as well, there's going to be an addition to the tour, a sort of like click here for more information type of thing about testimonies from alumni of the Rhode Island School for the Deaf, talking about how the schooling at the school has changed over time. So that will expand.
Oh, go ahead. No, she's not raising her hand.
So I have a question. I was interested in when I've heard you talk about this on more than one occasion, and I see like how passionate you are about this and how much it means to you. I was curious as to going forward in your plans after Brown, what you would like, how does this fit into your picture? Do you see it in the future? How would you like to remain in the deaf community as you are? Do you see it changing? How does that look for you in the future?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things which this project really taught me was understanding my positionality within the deaf community and understanding that I am and will always be a guest. I hope to be a treasured guest and a welcome guest, but I will always be a guest. So I don't plan to be working with the deaf community as my main professional job, but I do hope that it will be a main social community, and that I will always have deaf friends and deaf folks around me who can continue educating me as well as like being normal people who I hang out with.
I have one more question for you, if that's okay. No, you guys go ahead first.
Sure. You mentioned how you're going to continually work, how your project was heavily emphasizing cooperation with the deaf community. Mm-hmm. Moving forward, as the tour is consumed and used by members of the deaf community in the Lippitt House, is there a plan or a means by which to encourage feedback, encourage updating, or encouraging a change in something that may be in the tour in the future?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So we have not yet tested the tour. That is happening in like a week, which is very exciting. But yeah, so one of the difficulties with a video tour is that changing it means going back into the studio, presumably with the same people, to re-record, which is probably not feasible. But what I hope is that there will be additions to the tour and expansions on information. The tour which I created is roughly equivalent to the hearing tour, but not exactly the same. And there are some things that are left out and some things which are expanded on. So my hope is that someone else, either a student at Brown, a student at another university, or maybe a high schooler at the Rhode Island School for the Deaf would want to take this on as a project and sort of add more information to the tour. My big, perhaps unattainable dream is that this is a field trip destination for the Allen School for the Deaf, but that is probably farther in the future and would require a little bit more adaptation and accessibility some consultations. So something else for someone else to take up the mantle, I hope.
There's a question in the back.
Do you think this process or model of like making museums adaptable to the deaf community be applied to other museums like elsewhere across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So this museum, although it took me a very long time, right? I was doing it while being a full-time student and applying for jobs. And so it was also a relatively small budget. So the grant that I got was $2,000, $1,000 of which went to assistive technology and $1,000 of which went towards this tour. So $1,000 for a museum is actually not that much money, and applying for a grant is not that much money. So it's entirely possible that another museum here in Rhode Island or somewhere else could sort of use this model. I also think that had I been doing this work full time, I probably could have finished it in like a month. But because I was balancing a lot of other things at the same time, it took me the whole year. But I think this model was relatively low impact for the museum, and it had a huge increase in accessibility for the deaf community. So I definitely hope that it's a model that's taken up by others.
Professor Riker.
Sorry about interrupting before when you have questions. I was wondering if there's anything, is there any possible controversy related with the tour or the information that's provided during the tour, and how would you handle, say, the tour is open for the deaf community and people come to it, and if there's some complaints or controversy, how would you handle that?
I fully expect that there will be controversy. Like I said, it's a very sticky history, and Jeannie's legacy, and the legacy of oralism in the United States, is a very sticky and complicated history. So I expect that folks who, for example, there are still folks who think that deaf kids should not be educated with signing, that it should be oral only. I tried in the tour to represent Marianne, Jeannie's mother, her possible opinions about why she didn't want Jeannie to sign as fairly as I could, while at the same time recognizing the power dynamics of privileging hearing people's opinions about deaf folks over deaf people's opinions about deaf folks. So when I felt the two were in conflict, I opted to go with what my deaf consults were telling me, because that was the point of the engaged program. That said, I tried to be as balanced as I could. My hope is that people going to the museum can understand Jeannie's individual success in the context of oralism movements as a whole, and the legacy of her success for other people and how that has impacted other people.
Is there any tangible historical source material that speaks to Jeannie's perceptions of these issues?
Yeah, we have a journal, or we have some journal entries from Jeannie, which in the actual tour we quote from the journal, which is interesting. And so that has been helpful to me, but it by and large is not her opinions about things. It's more documentation of what happened. So for example, it says, there was a school for the deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut. My mother didn't want to send me there. Nothing was done for me until we started the oral method. So it doesn't say a lot about whether she liked that or not. And also, she didn't really have an alternative. She didn't have any other friends who were deaf until other people started being educated in the same way. She couldn't socialize with deaf people who could sign, so she had no idea what the other side was like. So unfortunately, we don't know a lot about her personal opinion type perspectives, although we do have her actual words, which is exciting.
That's great, Amy. Thank you so much. Last but not least for us.
Oh, thanks. Do you want me to hand these out? I can do that.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Hello. So, thank you, Annie and Connor, both for your presentations. I really enjoyed both of them. To get us to switch gears a little bit, I'd like us to watch this video that Professor D'Amico, my advisor, showed me. It's like a couple minutes, and we're just going to start it to like clear our minds. What does that have to do with the title of this presentation? Well, one day when I was in Professor D'Amico's office, and I was talking about how a lot of the coursework I had studied through the open curriculum, especially in computer science and computation over at RISD, had made me think more about simulations and what we can learn from them in academia, or in my discipline, which is government and economics. And the idea is that if birds are that complex, that they can fly in this fluid motion so exquisitely, where there's no leader, there's no anything to explain how that happens. And mathematicians and scientists have tried to formulaically calculate that series of interactions and numerically represent each bird's interactions to try to make sense of it. But really, it's so complex that how complex might humans be, which is an intelligent life form with so much nuances and intricacies. And so I wanted to think about government and economics in the context of simulations. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So government and economics is an independent concentration that is supported by the Political Theory Project and the Curricular Resource Center It's largely inspired by the government concentration at Harvard, which is like an emphasis in political theory rather than science, and a major at the London School of Economics and Political Science, which is called Government and Economics. And so it's about getting an understanding of both political philosophy as well as economics and how they intersect. And while that's largely been my home base here at Brown, I've also had the immense privilege to dip my hands into 3 other universities as well. I first started at the University of Michigan my first year, then I studied abroad in Spain, and I've taken several classes at RISD, and applying what I've learned to really get a better sense of how government and economics can be applied. And I first became interested in this because I started out in the economics department, but had a lot of economic questions and wanted to bring morals into the conversation when thinking about the economy. And that was because I grew up right outside of Boston. Oh, that's a shame. And I lived next to a town called Concord, Massachusetts, which is where Henry David Thoreau was from. And I grew up going to the pond all the time, swimming in it, boating, and reading a lot of his thought, which was a lot about material culture and how he moved to this pond to live in a cabin with the bare minimum necessities. And essentially, what he would write about is that we don't need that much stuff. We really don't. So then when thinking about huge economic issues like economic income inequality, it had seemed to me as though it's a cultural problem in a lot of ways, that there's a material culture emphasis, and it doesn't make sense for income inequality to be such a vast issue when there is enough for everyone to have a baseline amount of goods. And this video is not going to work for us today, unfortunately, I don't think. But essentially, it's a piece that I created, which is it's about Walden Pond and income inequality and how those two intersect. Maybe at the end, we can come back to it. And then the other is I was thinking about how this could be applied here in Providence. I was working in a City Plus Data exhibition at the Rhode Island School of Design, and one of the things we did was we created a virtual tour of Providence, Rhode Island, and we thought about how the implications of data, and what we did was we essentially got this tour of Providence, and then we can pull in US Census data that the government has provided to understand a city. Like as you go to a different neighborhood in Providence, you can select a data point and try to understand it and see how it differs by geography. And the more data points you add, it takes out color. Because the idea is that when we try to understand something so complex as a city, which is so humanistic and nuanced, essentially we're missing a lot of the picture. We're missing the stories, we're missing what it all means. These numbers can only mean so much, and that's why after you put on more than 4, it restarts. And so this was kind of the backbone of what I wanted to do for my capstone, thinking about how we are limited by what numbers can tell us and how we can try to understand complexity in a different way. And so that was kind of the underpinnings of this capstone presentation, which we will get into. So I worked on an economic simulation game that's being developed at MIT. A Brown alum who was very involved with the political theory project here, and he's now at MIT. I assisted him as he was doing the development. And so my role was data design and dynamics. So thinking about what information, what content, what should we bring into this game? How do we model history in a simulation? As well as thinking about basic design decisions, like how do we visualize information? How do we get people to play this? And how do we make it intuitive and seamless for a player? And finally, thinking about the dynamics, what stories do we tell? What stories do we not tell? How might the choices we make have implications? And how might we best capture political and economic history, 1700 to present, which is so much to think about. So to do this, I first started reading books. I went into Professor D'Amico's office, and he handed me each one of these. And it gave me the background knowledge that I need to think about a lot of these issues. It was bringing in different social biology books as well as complex systems theory, seeing how those intersect with philosophy, politics, and economics. And that provided me, I felt as though, with the baseline understanding of what I was getting myself into by taking on this project and how I could really do it justice. Then I conducted 5 different interviews with the experts themselves, and so I reached out to the political theory project faculty, and I asked each one of them a series of questions to help me think about this and narrow in on the key events in political and economic history. So thinking about what is essential for us to cover, what could we cover, what do you think? As well as thinking about the different economic variables that will be the mechanics of the simulation itself, because it needs to respond to complexity within it. So if a player is playing in it and they make a trade or they do something within the economy, it needs to respond to different economic variables. And so as well as thinking about what is the role of the individual in the game, can they change the course of history? If they're operating a firm or they're trading, can they accrue so much power that they can really change history? Is that feasible? And so these are questions I talked about with faculty to think about, as well as how institutions and their ideals and institutional competition and how that shapes economics, and the role of innovation as progress as well, and then how different stories fit into this and how we can really create something that accurately represents history, but also gives us an opportunity to reinvent history or allow players to redo history in such a way that is more moral, more righteous. And so these were things we were thinking about. Then it came into design. Since I created model concentration, I had a lot of flexibility through the open curriculum to apply what I had learned to this project as well. And that was through RISD classes and visual arts classes. I've learned a lot about visualizing information. And the game itself is called Buttonwood. And so this was the logo I made. And the idea behind it is that it is a button and it is wood. So it's capturing what the game is about within the logo itself. So it's like a logo that does, not just is. And so, again, just pulling different things that I learned over my time here at Brown, thinking about how it fits into this government economic space. And so I also created the website. And so we can go here. And it's just for anyone to get information if they want to. So there's like an about page, and it says like what this is essentially. And it's a startup game design company that he's building. So we're trying to think about both education and entertainment. It's not purely for academic purposes, but my role was really thinking about how can it be educational, how can it be academic, given that it's also supposed to be entertaining. And so, again, it's going to be like a player who is building a firm, investing, and they can have an impact in political and economic history. And so then if someone wants to play, they can sign up and get more information once the game is developed over the next few months, as well as helping him get more people to help us, different interns if they're interested, and contact information. And so that was, again, just kind of thinking about some of the things I learned here in the context of my capstone. Then finally, it came into the dynamics, and so I provided Isaac, who I worked with, like a 10-page report about how I see it moving forward and some things the game should capture. And so one of my big recommendations was to try to break political and economic history into its constituent parts or essentials, which I saw as trade, scarcity, progress and innovation, institutions, and incentives. If these were underpinning in the mechanics, I felt as though we could think about economics and what that environment would look like in a simulation. I also wanted to try to blur the lines between education and entertainment as much as possible, but I found that there's a lot of tension between the two in the sense that what might be the most educational might not be the most entertaining, and vice versa. And so some ideas I had for us to do that was to think about nonlinear storylines. So allowing the player to change the course of history. There's been so many economic tragedies, there's been so many low points in history that if we could give the player a form of agency to change that and reinvent history, recreate it, then I think that would be more compelling. I also suggested that it's a social experience where players can interact with other players, either afar or within it, like in the same room, just thinking about how it's not just a solo individualistic game. And I also really pushed for designing and developing it in virtual reality because I see that as like a teleportation device where one could really like immerse themselves and go back in time to try to think about history and some of these ideals as if they were experiencing it themselves. It's also been proven in a lot of studies that virtual reality is a tool for building empathy, and I wonder what that would look like in this context. And then finally, I was thinking a lot about the power of that we had as these designers and developers and the stories that we include and don't include. And I wanted us to be very conscious of whose stories we are telling when trying to narrow in on so much time and so many complex events. And that's where like the ethics and the political philosophy really comes in, and especially when thinking about simulating economics. And so, for instance, some ideas we came up with by talking to different faculty and research was that if we follow a family through the ages, like if a player is like a family, then they could switch and experience different roles within the family, see how maybe the role of a woman differs from the role of a man in 1700, or not just making it a singular experience and trying to evoke as many different perspectives as possible. But at the same time, there's so many issues that arise, like when thinking about things like the transatlantic slave trade or how the economy was built on human labor in very morally corrupt ways. And my recommendation for that is, well, I'm a Jewish American and the guy who's working with Isaac is also. And so if we want to try to simulate and represent issues like slavery and mass genocide, I personally felt as though it would only be ethical if we were depicting the experience of our ancestors, which were Jewish Americans, because creating a simulation where there's such serious topics and putting it in potentially the wrong hands or creating something that is a false representation is just too high of stakes to engage in. Whereas I feel as though if it's coming from a different place or a more personal place, then perhaps I have deeper perspective and ability to do that. And so these were some of my recommendations when thinking about the game dynamics themselves. And so essentially what I learned from this experience was a lot, but to break it into a few key bites, thinking about how history itself is a complex system with so many moving parts, and one way we can try to think about it is in this simulation model. Also that storytelling is political, which was a theme as well from Annie's and Conor's, and thinking about how that is unavoidable, and so what is the best ways to be conscious of that. As well as the fact that criticism is inevitable. We will make mistakes, but I do not think that's a reason to not pursue this project just because it is so difficult. As well as thinking about how education and entertainment can be combined. I think that would be an ideal world where everything entertaining is educational. And as well as thinking back to what my learning goals were when going through this independent concentration process, I feel as though I achieved those. And I also just really want to thank my professor, or my advisor, Professor D'Amico. When I was going through the independent concentration process, I had applied 2 times already, got rejected both, and then my advisor at the time had backed out on me. And this was before I met Professor D'Amico, and I went talked to him like after that, and I didn't even know him that well at the time, but said, I really need help. And he gave me that help, and that was so huge because if I did not have his support and support Professor Tomasi as well, then, and Peggy and the CRC, then I would not have been able to take all the classes that I did. I would have had to choose between political philosophy and some of my interests in art and design. And so by doing this independent concentration, I really got that intricate understanding of how political philosophy and economics combined, as well as I had time to explore the open curriculum. So overall, this capstone was really a byproduct of the support of the Political Theory Project, of Isaac, of the CRC, and I'm really thankful for my time at Brown, and the support of my family and friends as well. So thank you all for coming. Any questions? I don't know.
What is the stage of the project?
Sorry.
Like what, or do you have a timeline for, yeah.
Yeah, so over the next month, the beta is going to be launched, which essentially means it's the first test for usability. So the basic underpinnings of the game, what this might look like in a desktop setting first. So that should be within a month, but then we're trying to do the alpha, which would be the next stage up 2 to 3 months from now. And ideally by 2019, it would be all ready to go.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I understood when you were talking about the choice of narrowing the scope and why you wanted to narrow it to Jewish Americans, and I completely understand why you made that choice, and I'm curious if you want to expand on what you feel like you might have been losing by that, or like what sort of were the other things that you were considering when you ultimately opted for that choice.
Yeah, definitely. It's really tough because there's so much in history, especially economics, that is tied to these injustices, and like ranging from colonization to slavery to so many that it's almost like, well, just including one instance is insufficient, including just 5 instances is insufficient, including 50, 100. There's no sufficient amount. So thinking, well, what is okay ethically to try and even represent in this situation? The only one I can really think of is my own experience or where I come from, because inevitably trying to represent something in a simulation as complex as, let's say, slavery or genocide, which is directly tied to economic events like the Treaty of Versailles or World War II, and it's just impossible to hit it all. So thinking about maybe one instance if it's necessary to put as like an underpinning of the economic situation.
For your game, what types of like demographics of users were you trying to target to be potential users of the game?
Yeah, so I wasn't as involved as much on like the product side of it, so I'm not entirely sure. I know that that's something Isaac is focusing more on, but I think over 18 is one potential demographic, but then I guess whoever's interested, and we're still like balancing that education and entertainment act of like, well, what is this? Is it going to be like an Xbox game, or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So just not really my recommendation or idea, but I still think we have to figure that out and then go from there.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Are there any other games out there that are similar to this in terms of concept, or that have similarities, or is this a completely unique idea?
Yeah, there are quite a few similar ones. As part of the research, I researched like the 4 or 5 other ones that are sort of similar, and a lot of the political theory project faculty, I had actually played them before and experienced with them, so they were very helpful in thinking about like what has been done in the past. Others were more focused on European history, and definitely a lot of key differences, and so we're trying to differentiate ours, but not worry too much about that.
I'm actually thinking about the video show at the very beginning with all the birds sort of like coming in and flying and like meeting each other and parting away. And so I'm interested in just asking like how you're handling moments in history that actually bring Jewish American experience into contact, let's say the African American experience, let's say during the Civil Rights era or during government policies like FHA loans and those kinds of things. So how are you, is it part of your model to sort of like show the intersection points? Like you might not be following X, story for the entirety, but the intersection points where the Jewish American experience might meet another type of experience? Is that, I'm just asking, is that part of it, or like what is your screening in terms of like the tunnel you're allowing the gamer to go through?
Yeah, so we definitely want to do that as much as possible. So like part of what I did was when making like a timeline of the events, like categorizing a lot of key movements in history that one would be a part of, ranging from women joining the workforce to thinking about like Jim Crow and just different key political events or in policy, and how we can incorporate those as much as possible. And those were what we considered the key events that like we would not want to miss. So at least finding a way to contextualize that and tell as much of history as we possibly can, but also understanding that it's impossible to capture it all. So doing that justice and finding that balancing act.
If there aren't any other questions, maybe as a closing, if I could ask Conor, Annie, and Brett to circle back to the theme, history, storytelling, and making the past present, and what sort of came up towards the end with especially Brett and Annie talking about storytelling and it being political and not possible to be neutral. So maybe just takeaway thoughts, closing thoughts.
Go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, so I feel like my thoughts were pretty well expressed. I feel that when you try to be as neutral as you can with stories, you often end up telling the same narratives that have always been told, or putting emphasis on people who already have the power to tell their own stories. And so weighting your efforts slightly in the direction of those who don't typically have that power, I think ends up with a final product that is more true to everyone's experiences. So that was definitely what I tried to do in the tour. I think that's what you tried to do in the game. And when it comes to sort of considering how past wars can inform current policy decisions or past policy decisions can inform the present, I think that's important to consider as well. Whose stories are typically not told, and then trying to make sure that those opinions and those problems are particularly focused on when we try to make decisions for the future.
I would add to that and say, when thinking about like whose stories are not told, and questioning what is our, like, can we be the ones to tell people's stories who aren't told, or people who might be excluded from the conversation for whatever reason? Like, can we be a one to tell someone else's story? I don't know. That's one thing I have constantly tried to think about, because it seems as though it would not be doing it justice to disregard a story, but at the same time, one can only tell someone else's story so accurately. So thinking about like what we can tell and what we can try to tell, as well as like what we just can't possibly try to tell for someone else.
Yeah, well, first, I thought these were two great presentations. The theme of storytelling probably wasn't as apparent in my presentation, but when I was doing research to really learn about how the origins of the Bosnian War, the war in Kosovo, so much of it was Slobodan Milosevic was the president of Serbia, his ability to inflame nationalist tensions from the way he portrayed the history of ethnic division between all of these different striding communities in the Balkans. And that plays an enormous role in how you interpret policy today and how politics is conducted, whether that's in Syria, Bosnia, Kosovo, or Germany. So it's definitely a theme that ran through my research as well.
Conor, Brett, and Annie, congratulations.
Thank you.